Okay, so last class we started talking about virtue ethics again, and we explored this question of happiness. We talked about a lot of different goods, right? What makes happiness for you or other people, and we looked at Aristotle's idea. We even looked at a few flawed conceptions of happiness, like, the people who think that it's just wealth or just health or, just these things. And we mentioned this term virtue, and I said that we'd be exploring this in a lot greater detail. Today is where we start that. We're still working in fairly general terms today. We're not going to get to look at the virtues one by one like we're going to do over the next couple of weeks. When we go to book 3, 4, and 5. In book 2, he's concerned with a more general question. He's going to use specific examples, but he's concerned with this more general question, what is virtue? And we've used this term quite a bit over the course of this semester, right? And we've had a few definitions of it. And sometimes people focus in on these as if they're the definition of virtue. And a good definition should include everything that goes into it. So let's take, for example, just before we actually go into this, one definition that some people have used of virtue, that I'm starting to see show up in papers and journal entries. Socially approved character traits. That's true. Virtues are, in general, socially approved character traits. Does that tell you everything that virtue includes? Does that tell you an awful lot about it? The fact that it's socially approved, does that tell you why it's socially approved? Well, let's think, for example, about something that we tend to approve of. Honesty, right? Why is honesty good? Yeah.
I guess it would be for the opposite, because you're not lying, I guess. Because it's the definition, but you're telling the truth, it's better to be truthful than not. So
Yeah,
that's what we see.
And sometimes we can define things by negating their opposite. Don't be a liar. That's like saying be honest, right? What were you going to say?
Basically, if that's how you want to be treated, that's the energy that you want to put into the world. If you practice honesty, you'll get honesty back.
Yeah, there's something to that too. Oh, well, as a factual statement, you can be honest and other people might screw you over, right? And lie to you. But you're onto something really, really important by saying, how would you like to be treated? And there's a sort of reciprocity there, right? You look at how you would like other people to behave towards you, and then you can say, well, I should probably act that way too, if I want them to do that. Now we're starting to get further away from just social approval, though, aren't we? You can say, well, a given society thinks that it's important to be honest. Why? Well, because, that helps out interpersonal relations, or if we lie, then there's certain consequences that follow, or there's something just intrinsically wrong with lying. Kant thought that, for example. We can go through a process like this for anything that we want to consider to be a virtue. And you can think about this also with vices. If we say vices are, in general, socially disapproved of character traits, like being a coward, for example. Almost every culture doesn't like cowards. That's pretty universal. Well, what is it about cowardice that's a problem? That's something to think about. And when we ask this question, what is virtue, and correlatively, what is vice, we're getting into that why. We're not just asking a what question, we're actually asking a why question. What were we going to
My question was, so basically, I may have misunderstood. So under virtue ethics, honesty, so you're not honest just for the sake of being honest, or you're honest because of the consequences that may follow?
Well,
I thought the intention was a big part of it. Yeah.
It's a little bit more complex.
Right.
It's not just the consequences the way it would be for, say, utilitarianism.
Right.
But the consequences do have some weight in it.
Okay.
Let me go on with this, and maybe that'll become a bit more clear. So Aristotle Aristotle actually gives you a few definitions of virtue at different points in this. And this is one of the definitions that he gives you in Book 2. And you notice it has 4 main parts to it. And none of these have to do with socially approved character traits. That's in some way, it's an important part, but it's also kind of accidental. Why are these socially approved? Because they, deep down inside, have this. And Aristotle doesn't think that anybody like reasons this out and says, what should we approve of in society? Well, let's look at this and start looking for examples. Instead, he thinks that we end up doing this sort of on a more or less unconscious level in societies. But then we can bring theory to bear and make some more sense out of this. And that's what we're trying to do. So we're going to look at each one of these today. I just want to give you the general overview. A virtue is going to be a settled or established disposition or habit. So when we talk about a character trait, okay, a character trait, what makes it a character trait? It's something that a person tends to do over and over again, right? That could be a habit. If it's a trait that you have, it's not just something that you do once in a while. It's something that is specific to you, that somebody can say, that person is that way. Is every character trait necessarily a habit? Not necessarily. I mean, some could be due to certain parts of your body. Maybe you have a habit of chewing your fingernails. We tend to frown on that sort of thing. But maybe you also have something wrong in your brain that makes you chew your fingernails. That could be a character trait, but that wouldn't be a habit per se. That would be something you don't have so much control over. Because Aristotle thinks we do actually have control over our habits. You're at the age right now where you actually have the greatest opportunity to determine what kind of person you're going to be. Because you're almost fully developed as far as your brain goes. I don't know if you guys have followed any of these things, but when it comes to impulse control, those of you who are in your early 20s, you're not fully there as far as your brain development. Your brain is still developing. But you're way further along than you were when you were 18. Do you feel like you have more control over your impulses now than 3 years ago? I hope so. Do you think you have more control when you were 18 than you did when you were, say, 14? Yeah. The reason why middle schoolers, by the way, are such a pain to teach is because they have almost no impulse control development, and they're getting smarter and smarter. So they've figured out all these ways to get into things, and they're unable to keep themselves from getting into things. But you guys can do that now. And you guys are at the age where you have the unique opportunity to look at yourselves and say, what kind of person do I want to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And to lay down new habits. By the time that you get to my age, it gets more difficult. It's not impossible when you're 40, but it's harder. And then when you're 60, it's pretty well established. Most people don't change their personality much when they're in their 60s. If you're 80, you're probably not going to change at all, right? Unless you have some epiphany and some drastic religious experience, I guess. But it's probably not going to happen much. Choice. This is another thing that's really important. And we're going to look at this, what choice consists in for Aristotle more next class session. Aristotle thinks that our character traits are, in some respect, a product of our choices. Does he mean that you're perfectly responsible at every moment for every single thing that you do? No. But you are a product of the choices that you've made so far. And who you're going to be 5 years from now is a product of the choices that you're going to be making over the next, year, month, who knows. You have some control over what kind of person you're going to be. And what do the choices bear on? Actions. Well, this makes perfect sense, right? Because we've talked about actions a lot in ethics. What else? Emotions. Doesn't that seem like a strange thing to say? Choices bearing on emotions. I mean, do you choose to be angry when you're angry? Do you choose to be sad? You ever had somebody say to you, snap out of it? being sad is just a bad choice on your part when you're grieving about something. How does that come across to you? Yeah.
I think our emotions are like determined by our actions sometimes.
I think
Let's say if you do something wrong, then you feel bad about it. If you know that you did something wrong.
That's true. If you don't want to feel bad about things, don't do things that make you feel bad. And you can control what sort of situations you get into. If you know that you have a tendency to get angry, let's say you're the kind of person who gets angry when talking about sports. You get really into it. You know that you lose your temper when talking with people who don't see things the way that you do. Well, you could avoid those kind of situations. Once you're actually in the situation, you don't have a lot of control over whether you feel anger or not. But, one second, you do have control over what you do with it, don't you? How far you go with it. How you act on your emotion, yeah.
But that's what I was going to throw out there, and you just did, so.
But we have control over...
Right, so, because if you're angry, you can either indulge your anger, light the flame even more,
Yeah.
or try and reserve yourself and hold yourself back. You could still be angry, but not necessarily explode with anger. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and the better that you get to know yourself, the more control you end up having over what to do with your emotions. So, one of the very first things that they teach you in a lot of anger management books is to tell yourself, as soon as you get angry, somebody stupid is in charge at this point. And that sounds really silly. One second. That sounds really silly, doesn't it? But actually, it is helpful. And they also teach you little things like, when you get angry, take 10 deep breaths, this somatic stuff. And you might say, that's just crazy stuff. You're still going to be angry. Well, taking the time actually helps you to cool down a little bit, to gain a little perspective. It's not a surefire thing, but you can learn these techniques, and you can also learn your own makeup so that you can make better choices about emotions and about actions.
When you're saying that we can't control the feeling of anger, but we can kind of control how we show it, is that kind of what you're getting at?
Sort of, although Aristotle will say that we don't have a direct control once we actually start feeling it. We do have a control over how we shape ourselves and our perceptions over time, and that will affect how we feel it, how much we feel it, when we feel it.
Because there's a kid that I live with who, when you brought up gets angry over sports, is the first person, and he's always over my house, so he brought it up.
Yeah.
But and he has a social disorder.
Okay.
So he gets very angry over the Knicks games, and we talk to him every time he yells. And I just feel like
it's bad.
she's our RA too.
Yeah.
So
Like I live next door, and I live upstairs, and he lives downstairs, and I can hear him as though he is in my room.
Oh, that's pretty out of
So,
control.
I was thinking maybe that there's some circumstances where you can't quite control the emotions.
Yeah, that brings up a good point. We're going to get into this again more again in book 3 and in book 7. I mentioned this last class that there's quite a few things, and I think it was in response to a question, that there are some things that we consider to be psychological disorders, which Aristotle would see as perhaps having some psychological element, but that actually being moral issues. So that in our culture, we've tended to push the moral off to one side and to make everything into psychological things that we can diagnose and then say the person's not responsible for. Aristotle would sort of push back. He wouldn't go all the way and say you're responsible for every single thing. There's no such thing as a person who's got a psychological disorder that keeps them from making the right choices. He would recognize that in certain cases. But he would say that there's a lot of cases where it's more moral than psychological, and then there's a lot where they sort of interact with each other. And I suspect that the case that you're talking about would be like that. Although, Aristotle cautions us, don't make general, absolute declarations about individual cases until you look at the facts and you draw on some experience, which is, I think, a good idea. Let's go on a little bit with this. Observing the mean relative to us, that's another important characteristic, and this is a distinctive contribution that Aristotle makes. With Plato, you don't have a concept of a mean, with the virtue being in between two extremes. You have the virtue, and then you have a vice, like justice and injustice, courage, cowardice, temperance, intemperance, right? Moderation, immoderation, I guess you would say, lack of moderation. Wisdom and foolishness. With Aristotle, the virtue is actually going to be located in a middle position between two extremes. So that's something new, and we're going to talk about that a bit more. Then determined by reason as the prudent person or the virtuous person. Virtuous.
You gotta put it in your
Yeah. Knew there was something missing. Okay. Thanks. So determined by reason, that sounds like Plato, doesn't it? Reason is the capacity that tells us what we ought to do. Wisdom is the virtue of that capacity. Reason should be governing the appetites. It should be governing our sense of honor or anger, things like that. But Plato doesn't talk so much about examples. For Aristotle, examples are really important. Aristotle thinks that we learn what it is to be virtuous, which is good, and unfortunately we also learn what it is to be vicious, by observing and then imitating other people. So the good news is, if you've got some good people in your life, without even necessarily thinking about it, you might have imitated them and become virtuous in certain respects. Bad news is, just the exact opposite. If you've got some bad people in your life, you may have started to imitate them, take on their characteristics, and become vicious as a result. And entire societies can in some ways be virtuous and vicious. Our society has certain things that it doesn't really want to talk much about, but Aristotle would. And the things that our society doesn't want to see as vices that Aristotle would, maybe other societies would see those as vices, but they'd have their own problems. So we're going to look at each one of these in turn, but first I want to talk about something else that he brings up. He uses this word nature a lot. And I want to make really clear, his idea of nature is kind of complicated. It's not something just like what you have in biology class or physics class or something like that. Let's take, for example, when you talk about the nature of things. This is a piece of chalk. It has a certain nature, right? Is anybody in here a science major? I know there's some sort of calcium compound, but I don't remember exactly what it is offhand. Does anybody? I think they make this from limestone. That sound about right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So we know certain things about this. And it's a physical object. If I drop it, it's going to fall, right? As Aristotle says, you can take a stone and throw it up in the air as many times as you want. You're not going to train it to stay up there. It's going to keep doing the same thing. This has a very fixed nature. So does this. This is a different nature. This is the thing I wipe my glasses with, because nowadays apparently you can't wipe your glasses on just anything. It's got to be this special kind of cloth. Otherwise, the coating they put on it gets screwed up, right? So it's got a certain nature, and it's good for something, wiping my glasses. You wouldn't use it for other things, like blowing your nose or wiping the board or anything like that, because it's got this purpose. Those are very simple things.
That are probably like $10 each. Probably like.
I have no idea. I get them when I get my new glasses every 2 years or so. And then I try like hell not to lose them. I'm used to like wiping glasses on shirts or anything like that. This has actually been a source of great irritation for me. By the way, the fact that I have to have this special thing to wipe my glasses, which is probably a sign I'm not virtuous with respect to anger yet. Okay, so now think about more complicated things. Now we get into the world of living things. What about plants? You plant a seed. You remember back in your elementary school you did some experiment with planting seeds? What happens if you water it, if you actually put it in the right place? The seed splits open, a little sprout comes up. maybe you took it home, maybe it was a watermelon plant, and, you know, because that's one of the easiest things to grow. You put it in the backyard, and either it grew and made watermelons or it died. Or maybe a pumpkin. Pumpkins are also one that they do for kids too, right? Beans, that would work too, yeah. Beans are good because they're nice and big, so you can observe it too. Now, we don't talk about plants as being capable of anything moral. Can you do an awful lot with a plant? Can you change its habits, its nature? Can you bring out certain things of it? Yeah, over time, you know, with breeding, think about corn, for example. You know, we have all this corn that we use for making all sorts of products, even gasoline, right? Ethanol. And ears of corn are about this long. Did they start out like that? No, right? At the time that Cortez and the conquistadors were coming into Mexico, which was, corn was the staple crop along with beans and squash, corn was about that big, like those little baby corn you see in the what we call Chinese food here, right? And they grew it and they bred it to be bigger and bigger and bigger, but not this big. That would really be something. Maybe they'll be this big, you know, when you guys are old, so they keep getting bigger. Even this amount was a big advance, because corn was a grass, and it was domesticated. And we took it and we slowly brought out things that were there in its nature, but weren't there to begin with. We cultivated it. And it's that way with every other plant that we've cultivated. And you know, you can do this with other plants, not necessarily food plants. You can train them to move certain ways. You can take trees and you bend them and they'll stay bent. But there's not an awful lot of development going on there. What about animals? How many of you have dogs or cats as pets? So a good proportion. How many of you had dogs or cats as pets? Probably some of you living in the dorms, you know, you had them at one time, right? Can you change the nature of a dog or cat in any sort of absolute way? Can you make a cat bark? Can you take a dog and make it not interested in other animals? Maybe, but you'd have to really, really change that dog. There are people who like, you know, their dogs to be vegetarians and things like that, but you have to do incredibly complex things or else the dog gets you know, vitamin deficiencies and gets kind of sick if you don't do it just right. Yeah.
That's like my brother has an Australian sheepdog, and the dog is, we call it a bipolar dog, my mom and I, like, because it's just so hyperactive, and
Yeah.
his girlfriend has been trying to train it to like not be hyperactive, but you can't change that. That's how the dog is.
That's tough to do, yeah.
That's how the dog is.
And it's probably that way in part because a lot of the dogs that we have as domesticated breeds were bred to do something. And if the dog isn't actually doing something like that, the dog is going to be unhappy.
Yeah, like she'll go up next to you and try to push like against your leg, and you're
Yeah.
like, "What are you doing?" And then you realize
She's hurting you.
that's what she does.
Yeah, I remember seeing a sheep herding dog once herding kittens. There was this litter of kittens, and this dog, a friend of mine had it. It wouldn't let the kittens just wanted to wander off, you know, which is what kittens do because they're curious. They're following instincts as well. And this dog would keep them all within like a small circle.
She does that with the pool. Like if the kids are jumping, like trying to jump into the pool, she'll go around the pool and try to get them all into the pool. And
Well,
if
that
they're-
makes sense,
If
yeah.
they're not in the pool, then she starts to bark.
Yeah, no, that's a case where what we did with breeding these dogs is we took something that was there in the dog's nature as a potential, and then we bred it to become something more and more actual. And in some respects, some of these breeds are prisoners of their instincts that way. You know, Dalmatians are a great example too. There was a lot of problems with Dalmatians about 20 years ago with them biting kids. And the reason why that was happening is everybody had seen, you know, 101 Dalmatians and they're really cute, so they'd get a Dalmatian puppy. What they didn't realize is Dalmatians are war dogs. They were bred by the Dalmatians who live, that was the name of a particularly warlike and pirate-infested band of people living in the Adriatic, near what's now called the city of Trieste. And they were independent for most of their existence. They gave the Romans a hard time, they gave everybody a hard time, until they were finally subjugated and made part of Italy. And they bred these dogs, these beautiful black and white, spotted dogs, to go run alongside the fighting men and tear the throats out of people. And they were bred to be very loyal, to bond with their owners, and to protect them. That's why they're so good for firefighters. Not so good for kids. It's sort of like leaving a loaded gun around, right? They have very strong instincts that way. Could you, raise them in such a way so that it's very unlikely that they'll bite? Yeah, but you'd have to do a lot more work with them than with some other breeds. Now, can you take any dog as a puppy and turn it into a bad dog? How? What would you do?
Abusive and neglected disorder.
Yeah, those are probably be neglectful for one thing. Don't treat it.
Well, I bet
and then
it
abuse
depends on the dog, because I guess if the dog depends on its personality, it can either like go back into itself and kind of just be scared of everything. I've seen dogs like that, or it can fight back. Depends on the personality of the dog.
Yeah, and you can take a dog. I mean, dogs are fighting animals. They're like us. They have their eyes in front. That means that we eat meat. We can be vegetarians, but we're biologically predatory creatures. We're actually the most successful predator. And dogs are a particularly successful predator too. And you can encourage those bad traits. You can turn them into killing machines if you want to. And that would be taking their nature and bringing out certain parts of it and then dampening the rest. Because dogs can also be incredibly affectionate, loyal. It's part of why we like them, isn't it? Cats, we can do a little bit less with them, I think, than we can with dogs. They're a bit more independent. But you can bring out certain things in them, and you can also screw them up pretty badly too, can't you? Human beings are like this too. And like Aristotle says, we're not naturally good and we're not naturally bad. We have capacities for goodness or for badness, but they have to be developed. And they will be developed in one way or another, depending on, the choices that a person makes, the environment that they find themselves in, the models that they take. So it's not a completely neutral thing. By the time that you're your age, you've already made a lot of choices and you're the product of those choices. By the time that you're my age, you actually see a lot of the effects of that over time. And what we're doing when we think about virtues and vices, we're cultivating certain things that we have as capacities by nature, but we're making them take on a certain shape, either for good or for bad. And this is a good place to take up this notion of habit. Aristotle asks, how should we understand a virtue, a character trait? One way to think of this is in terms of a capacity. And I'm going to use anger as an example here because it's a very clear example. All of us have a capacity to get angry, don't we? Do any of you not have the capacity to get angry? Somebody starts poking you, doesn't say why, just keeps poking you, would you eventually get ticked off at them? Some of you probably wouldn't even be eventually. Like me, it would take like 3 or 4 pokes and I'd want to know what the hell is going on, and I'd, start getting irritated with the person, right? Even if they gave me a rational explanation, I might still be irritated. I'm doing an experiment. Why are you doing it on me? Why are you doing this right now? We have a capacity for getting angry. Would you be a better person if you didn't have any capacity for being angry? Stoics thought so. What do you think? Would you be virtuous if you were, let's say you had all your other emotions, but you didn't have this one?
feel like you need to be ready to get angry when you have to, but it shouldn't, that you need to decide when it's more appropriate.
Yeah, and I think Aristotle would see things the way that you do. That there are times when we ought to get angry. I mean, it's in our nature for a reason. What does anger help us to do that sometimes we need to do? Yeah. Defend ourselves. You're right. It's at a bodily level, the anger response, it's what we do to prepare ourselves for fighting. So that's why we sometimes fight when we're angry, follow through on it. Yeah.
I was gonna say like I thought about it. And it's probably not right, but like if somebody like commits like a heinous crime, and we get like angry with them and like presenting justice and stuff and like putting them away, but that would probably be under something different, right?
Well, it's interesting because Aristotle actually thinks that if it's you might say if it's structured, if it's set up the right way, if anger is not going beyond bounds that it should not exceed, that anger can actually, our feeling of anger can actually be a good index for figuring out how much a person should be punished. Anger is actually a desire to punish other people, in part, to respond to threats. And so Aristotle himself would be very sympathetic to the notion that anger in a certain way could be legitimate when it comes to sentencing people. So the judge who's actually angry at the person that he's sentencing and gives him a longer sentence because of the crime that he committed and the circumstances in which it was committed might be doing the right thing from Aristotle's point of view. It's not a point of view that's widely held.
No, because of the fact of like determinate sentencing and stuff like that. And
We think a person should be calm when they're sentencing, right?
Yeah, and like giving them what you would give everybody for that.
Yeah, and that does have to do with the need to be just. Aristotle then says, well, could virtue be the emotion itself? And we have all sorts of emotions. We have the emotion of anger. We've all felt that. We have sadness, happiness, surprise, curiosity, admiration, pity, envy. There's an emotion that he's got a Greek word for that we often use the German word Schadenfreude, which means taking joy in somebody else's pain or damage or something like that. Aristotle's term literally means setting your hand to badness, turning your hand to doing something bad. Malice is a word that we have. That's an emotion too. Sympathy, friendship, these have to do with emotions. It's not the emotion itself though, right? As you were pointing out. Yeah.
It's almost like the channel that you use to express that emotion.
Yeah, I think that's...
When Mark said you could, like, if you saw someone doing something, you could get angry and go in there and fight them yourself, or you could get angry and call the cops. And that's like almost finding the most productive way to channel your emotion.
Yeah. That's a very Aristotelian way to look at it. How you don't have control usually over whether you feel the emotion itself. You do have an awful lot of control over what you do with it. I mean, if you have the belief that every time you get angry, you have to hit somebody, very early on in your life, you'll have somebody who takes you aside and makes that distinction for you and says, you don't always have to act on your anger. It's not right to do that. It's okay to tell somebody you're angry, but not okay to throw a block at them, or something along those lines. And it's very hard to stick to this. And this is why habit becomes so important. How do you manage to do the right thing with what you feel, or what you desire, or what you want to do? I mean, there's knowledge. And Aristotle's going to say, being angry with the right person, for the right amount of time, for the right reason, those sorts of things. Those are in part products of knowledge. You could say you shouldn't be angry at somebody just because they took something away from you that you like, because maybe you didn't have a right to have that thing. You can tell somebody that. is that enough to work? To give them a virtuous disposition? Does everybody just say, now I get it, I'm going to quit being a bad person. I'm going to do the right thing. We have to have habits. We have to establish, you talked about channeling. Think of what it takes to establish a channel. You have to dig a groove, and habit digs grooves into our personality and our action by repetition, by facing situations in which we have to act on these, or other things as well. And we have to choose certain responses, you might say, certain courses of action. And if we do that over time, eventually we could acquire the habit, say the virtuous habit, in this case, forgot the you again, of what Aristotle calls good temper. Or we could develop bad habits and become irascible. That's kind of a funny word to throw out there. Somebody who's just hot-tempered, who loses control too easily. There's a lot of ways to go wrong with anger. We're going to look at this more specifically later on. How do you develop this? Well, you face situations in which it calls for a certain response. So let's go away from anger now, and let's think about fear. All of you have faced situations of fear, right? Probably still do. Let's think about some common situations that come up. Think about two in particular, childhood ones. So you faced a bully. Every one of you has probably had somebody who messed with you at one time or another, right? Probably a lot of people. Because what do kids do with each other when adults aren't supervising? Start screwing with each other. And kids will play together nice for a while, but inevitably, even kids who are friends with each other will start picking at each other, won't they? That's the way we are. Again, maybe that has to do with our being predatorial. And so what do you do when somebody starts picking on you? One thing you feel probably is anger, but you also feel a sense of fear quite often. What do you do in the face of that fear? Do you give in? You say, I'll give you whatever you want, just leave me alone? If you do that often enough, what's going to happen? Not only socially outside of you, but what's going to happen within you?
You'll start to back down within yourself.
Yeah, you'll like approach each situation like that, and the fear will be greater and greater. Yeah.
It's weird that you bring that up. We had a kid yesterday back at the high school that I used to go to, or now that I'm in college, who committed suicide yesterday because he was bullied. And you kind of feel alone because you don't think that anyone kind of has your back,
Yeah, one of the things that they express often is, despair about it never getting better, but fear about. They say, I don't want to go to school. I don't want to even get out of bed because of what's going to happen. It may be that for some, in order to cultivate some virtues, we need the assistance of others. It's difficult to stand up to bullying when you are totally isolated. What happens if you stand up to the bully? I mean, you might get popped in the nose, right? That's no fun, but what happens? Is it easier to stand up to them the next time? Or mean kids picking on you, or whatever, Yeah, it becomes easier. Think of another example that's probably a bit closer in time. How many of you right now still feel a sense of fear when you have to give a talk, a presentation, some sort of public address? So about a third of the class. How many of you felt that originally when you first started giving presentations? Almost everybody? Yeah. I mean, there are some people who don't. My mom, she liked playing teacher all the time. She was, sort of life of the party kind of person. She didn't ever really seem to be afraid of that sort of thing, even when she was a kid. I know it scared me, especially when I first started teaching. I would actually get up and I'd keep my hands behind the podium because they would shake, because I was so nervous. And I imagine my first few years of teaching were probably terrible for my students. in part because I'd over-prepare because I was, worried about it. And then after a while, you get used to it, don't you? Those of you who've been forced to do public speaking, had to take a speech class or something like that, did you find yourself eventually overcoming that fear? Even though those of you who feel the fear, are you able to function when you're called upon? Are you able to get yourself up there to do it? Yeah.
Me and actually had this teacher for American National Government,
Yeah.
who I think she's a philosophy teacher here, but she was like very nervous when teaching, and I think it was because she never had taught that class.
Yeah.
But like she had been a teacher for a while, you know what I mean? So
She's like so smart, but everyone in the room was like, and it was very difficult to listen to her because
Yeah.
she wasn't getting her point across without saying
All the
she
filler
like,
words,
yeah, it was so hard to follow her.
Yeah, there's something to that. I mean, when I have to get up and give like a really big lecture in front of a ton of people, then I start to get a bit more nervous again. Like I gave this St. Anselm lecture at St. Anselm College back in 2008, and by then I had been teaching for 8 years, and I'd done a lot. I'd done probably 30 conference presentations, but this is a big thing. This is like an invited lecture. I was the whole show, and I remember being at that podium, and that podium was a lot higher. It was like this high, and I had to talk for 45 minutes, and I had this whole long prepared thing. And I remember being really nervous that I'd like start stumbling over the words, or maybe stuttering, or who knows. And then I thought, I had the feeling like, boy, if I go off the tracks, I'll never be able to get back. And I got myself through it, but I was feeling anxious the whole time. There's actually a podcast on it, so if you want to hear it, you can listen to it and see whether you think I'm engaging in any of those sort of things. And then it turned to the question and answer period, and suddenly something kind of like clicked, and I was okay. And then I was actually kind of a smart ass in some of the answers. You can listen to the podcast. Yeah.
Jerry Seinfeld makes a joke that more people, there was like a study, more people are afraid of speaking in public than they are of death. You'd rather be in the casket than the person giving the eulogy.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I actually have some experience with giving eulogies, and I can tell you that gets easier over time too. You come from a big family, I got asked to give a lot of eulogies because there's always a lot of deaths. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like no matter how many speeches you give, you're still going to get those first moment jitters. I don't know. It's the way I feel. Like I've given like a ton of presentations. I work with people. Like I don't get them, in my office, but like when I'm giving large presentations,
Yeah.
you get those first like 30 seconds to a minute, and then after that, like it just drops off. I don't know.
it happens in sports too. I've been playing football my whole life, and even my senior year in high school, I would still get nervous before games.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember I did track, and I would always get nervous. You get into the blocks, you'd always get nervous before you'd have to, before the pistol would go up. And the thing I get the most nervous about is, what if I hear it and I don't respond the way I'm supposed to, and like take off immediately? What if I do a false start?
It's like the beginning to it. It's like with games, like you get out there and the whole crowd's watching you, and then speeches, you get up and the whole class is watching you. It's like the beginning. It's just, it puts so many different like thoughts into your mind and stuff like that, and it just messes with your head.
Yeah. Now Aristotle would say, to go back to this, how do you end up getting better and better at this? You put yourself in situations where courage is called for. And courage itself is not the opposite of fear. Courage is what you do with that fear. Courage is also what you do with the feeling of confidence, because you can go, this is a good segue into this, you can go to another extreme as well. Think about the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. If you had to sum that up in 3 quick statements, what would you say? Not even sentences, but statements. What is the story based around? I get you started. 2. T-O-O. What? Okay, we'll start with that. Too cold. Too hot? Just right, yeah. And if you wanted to make it more general, too much, too little, just right. Well, it's the same way with virtues and vices according to Aristotle. You have vices at the end of excess, too much. You have vices at the end of deficiency, too little. And then you have that hard to reach and sometimes hard to actually define well, just right. Think about porridge for an example. You know, we don't actually eat porridge, we eat oatmeal or things along those lines. What makes it just right? Or forget heat. How much sugar should you put in? A lot. Some people might put in way too much. You know, some people don't even seem to realize you can put sugar in. You're an adult. You want to eat sweeter things. You know, you don't have somebody telling you you can't. Yeah.
I mean, it's like it's an individual preference for everybody. Everyone's just right is different.
Yeah, when it comes to matters of taste like that, there's a wide range of subjectivity. But we would actually look at somebody kind of strange who puts more sugar than porridge. Yeah, you know, we'd say maybe you should eat something different. Yeah. And we can do this with a lot of different things in life. If we want to use anger as an example, and this will be the last time that I use it in this class, you can get angry with a person to the right amount. And this is a difficult thing to pin down, but there are examples that we can look at. There are some sort of fairly general rules, right? If you get so angry at somebody over bumping you in a line that you have to hit them, clearly you're on the side of excess, right? What sort of thing might be an appropriate response? Somebody's, bless you, somebody's really rude and bumps you in line as they're moving past you. What would you consider an appropriate response? Because just sucking it up and saying, oh, I'm sure they didn't mean it, that might be too little. What do you think?
Give them a look, something, you know, say
People
something.
do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll definitely get the message across that, hey, you just bumped into me, don't do it again, kind of deal.
Yeah.
Tell them watch where they're going.
Yeah.
That would probably be fairly appropriate. That'd be a lot better than just like going into like a 5-minute, you know, string of profanity, wouldn't it?
You'd be shocked how people respond to
Oh,
people
sure.
bumping into them.
Well, you know, that's because, and this is another good segue too. Aristotle thinks that with some matters, some things that virtue and vice is concerned with, societies and people in general can be too often on one side or too often on the other side. And probably with anger, as human beings, we tend to make the mistake of going too far with it, getting angry at too many people, too long, those sorts of things, rather than not getting angry enough. And then there are people who don't get angry when they ought to get angry, but they're more rare than people who get more angry, aren't they? What do you think, in your experience? People more often get angrier than they should, or less angry than they should?
More angry.
Yeah, that one's pretty simple. And you know, there are some people who sort of choke back their anger, and then they act in passive-aggressive ways. Aristotle actually puts that on the side of the too much, because it's still anger, and it's held on to until they can find some way to address it. Think about other things too. What about justice and injustice? There's justice, you know, in the sense of fairness, giving people what's fair, taking only your fair share. And then there'd be like taking too much for yourself, and then there'd be taking too little for yourself. Which side do people tend to, if they make a mistake, which side do they fall on, usually? Too much, yeah. In our society, at least. There might be some in which everybody's bending over backwards to make sure that they don't take, you know, their fair share and everybody else gets more than them. But that's pretty rare, isn't it? Yeah.
I was going to say with the example that we had earlier with sentencing somebody, you could either be very angry at them and sentence them to twice as long as they should, or kind of let them off real easy due to some some like other reason, or like determinate sentencing where no matter what your background is or anything like that, like if you commit a robbery, you get this many years, you know.
When we get to justice, which we're going to look at in Book 5, we'll see what Aristotle says. He would not be a big fan of determinate sentencing, in part because it doesn't allow enough latitude to the judge to look at the circumstances and the moral character of the person.
But he would still put too little into it.
Oh yeah,
Into
definitely.
account,
Yeah, you can definitely think about it in terms, and you have to compare it to other people too. So similar cases should be treated similarly, Aristotle would say.
But with some sort of discretion.
Yes, exactly. The word that he uses, the word that Aristotelians typically use is equity, but you're right, in modern day criminal justice it would be what we call discretion. Yeah.
I mean, the whole idea as to why limits are placed to judges to a particular sentence was
Yeah.
because of abuse of power.
Yeah, and
So,
it could fall on either side. too.
Right. So for us to allow a judge to not have any limits would make us to believe that he's a true virtue ethic, which most likely a judge
Yeah.
around here would not be. So, I mean, a judge would sentence somebody different that committed a crime in his hometown versus someone who did it in another town. He would feel more anger towards that, potentially, because he feels more closely related to it. So the idea is that, like, anger, yes, it should play a part. As a judge, you should feel the anger for society aspect.
Yeah.
But, however, you should be the more rational one out of everybody in making your decision.
Yeah. Aristotle's not saying that the judge should be angry all the time.
Right.
What we're talking about with discretion is relating a different topic.
Okay.
You could exercise discretion being angry or being calm.
Okay.
So, and there could be other emotions that could come in too, like you know, the sympathy for somebody from your hometown, for example. So let's go back to this. Let's think about one other one. What about cowardice and courage? Is there something that goes beyond courage, that goes too far? Sure. Aristotle calls it rashness or foolhardiness. This is the person who sees conflicts everywhere and responds to threats that aren't actually there, and feels either not enough courage at all or too much confidence in these sort of situations. So they jump in and they get in all these fights with people. Now, you know people like that. Not necessarily fist fights, but you know people like that who like to argue all the time, who seem to seek out opportunities for getting into the clash when they don't need to. That would be too much, wouldn't it? They're not afraid of the consequences of what they do or say. These are the people who write, ranting emails. Really bad to send any sort of email when you're upset, right? Because emails are forever, whether you realize it or not. Now, do people make, in general, in your experience, there are some people who are courageous. They are in the middle. Would you say in our society, people more often err on the side of foolhardiness or more often err on the side of cowardice? In your experience, what do you think?
Can you say this question again?
Well, there's some people that fall in the middle that are actually courageous. And then there's these two vices, foolhardiness and cowardice. In our society, where do you think more people who aren't courageous fall in? Do you think they're more tending towards cowardice, giving in on things, or towards foolhardiness? Yeah.
I don't know, right now at this stage,
Bless you.
I think I see a lot more foolhardiness than
Okay,
flight, but it's probably going to change.
that's interesting. When do you think it'll change?
I don't know, just when I'm not surrounded by
College
Yeah.
people. Yeah, in a way, the risks are lower when you're a college student. When you've actually got, house, spouse, career, kids, mortgage, all that sort of stuff. It might be a little harder to stand up for things. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say cowardice is more someone and only like a few people walk by out of like the hundreds say anything?
Yeah. That's a good point. And it would be, you'd have to observe those people who say something in multiple cases to see whether they fall
Yeah,
in this
sometimes
or...
it's both, or like one or the other. I mean, some are really over the top, really angry, and some like handle it really responsibly. So there's a mix in there, but the majority of people just end up walking by.
Yeah. Somebody had their hand up over here in the sort of Adams scheme. Or just...
Alright, I feel like what Alyssa said, like there's, like, we tend to think of the people that use it in excess a lot, because like that's like
They stand out.
Yeah, that's the impression that we get. But I feel like for every person that uses their courage in excess, there's a lot more people that are deficient in it.
Yeah, because that doesn't stand out.
Because like that show, you see the one or two people, like as you see that one person that's using it in excess, there's 3 or 4 people walking behind them not doing anything. So.
Yeah, and so now Aristotle says another thing about this too. He says, if you find yourself having a vice, and you want to change that, then, or if you're not sure where you fall in, and say one of them is further away from the virtue, it's okay to overshoot a little bit. So when you're teaching, let's say we think about assertiveness training. Assertiveness training is one way in our society that we use to try to inculcate a little bit of courage into people, isn't it? We say, no, you don't have to act this way. You don't have to like punch them or use abusive language, but you can tell them how you feel. So we lay down certain limits. But if somebody's going to do that, if they're struggling with cowardice, maybe it's okay if they overshoot a little bit so they can come back this way. Because it's harder to go this way if this is further away. The other thing that he says that's really important is the person who's in the middle, they're the standard. And the person who's virtuous, they're a model. They behave the way that, say, a just person or a courageous person or a temperate person behaves. You can behave the same way as them without necessarily having that habit established, without having the virtue. That's a good thing to do. But it doesn't mean that you actually have that habit. And how can you tell if somebody does or doesn't have that habit? You look at whether they actually enjoy doing it. So, for example, myself, I'm not just all the time, I don't have to actually be just all the time to have the virtue, but I'd have to be just most of the time. Not only would I have to be just most of the time, I would have to be just for the right reasons, because I actually enjoy doing that sort of thing. So there'll be cases where you can be just with your time or attention or stuff like that. I'm not always happy about that. Even when I do the right thing, I'm not always doing it because I really love it. I recognize it as the right thing. I wish I could get away with not doing it sometimes. And so I'm not actually virtuous in that respect. The virtuous person is the standard, but that doesn't mean that every action that's in accordance with virtue is already virtue. Use this ad for injustice. I'm willing to bet that every single one of you has taken more than your fair share at one time or another. Yeah? Anybody who hasn't? Probably not, right? Did you feel bad when you did it? Not at all?
I mean, I think it depends what we talk about.
Pick anything you like. If you recognize it as more than your fair share, so you did something that you at that time knew was wrong, did you feel bad about it?
I mean,
Did you think it was the wrong thing to do?
I mean, sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. I mean, sometimes, let's say my mother used to bring some cookies on.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go, that's where you brought it from. If I had like 5 cookies, I would just take 3 and just give 2 to her. So I would go.
That's mildly unjust, yeah. Instead of breaking it down the middle or something, right? I mean, it's a trivial instance. My point is this. If you actually recognize, if you do the wrong thing, but you recognize the wrongness of it, Aristotle would say you're not yet vicious. The vicious person actually becomes blind to this over time and comes to see the vice as the normal thing, and then tends to push the virtue off onto the other side, or tends to sort of annex the virtue to their vice. So they'll say, everybody's out for themselves. You got to take as much as you can get. That's the right thing to do. That allows you to see egoism as, in some ways, an expression of vice, right? Or the angry person who gets far too angry, they either see themselves as being virtuous, I'm angry to the right amount, or they say everybody else is, including the virtuous person, they're not angry enough, they're not behaving the way they should. The rash person sees the courageous person as being a coward, because they back down sometimes. The coward person who's got that in their soul tends to see the courageous person as being foolhardy. And they see themselves as being prudent. There's other virtues and vices that are particularly important. We're going to look at these more specifically when we go to books 3, 4, and 5. But I wanted to mention them very quickly here. Talking about emotions and actions, right? What are actions concerned with? When Aristotle says actions, that could be a little bit misleading. That works for courage, for temperance, for justice. But you have to think about what are the objects of your actions. What kind of actions are you engaged in? So think about something that we care quite a bit about. Money, right? And now think about your personal relations with other people. Is everybody totally on their own as far as money when you're thinking about family and friends? Or do you sometimes spend money on other people? Or give them things? Or do they give you things? It's the other, right? So, can you give too much to people?
Mhm.
Or should you always just give more and more and more and more? Yeah.
I think once you give too much to people, they expect that from you, so then
That's a problem,
the
yeah.
next time like you do it and you don't give them that as much, they take you for granted. Or even if you give them a lot, they'll sometimes still take you for granted for it.
That is one problem with what Aristotle calls prodigality, which is giving too much of goods or property in relations. What about the other extreme? Are there people who just want to take and not give? Yeah. The right amount is to give in sort of some rough reciprocal way, but to be more concerned with giving than taking, right? Those are the kind of people you'd want to have as friends, the generous. Aristotle uses this word liberality, which we don't use that much in our society, so I think generous probably works better for that one. And think about all the different ways in which you can be generous, just on a level as a college student. Do you ever go out to eat with your friends? Who picks up the tab? Does everyone split it perfectly equally, or do you ever pick up the tab and they get it the next time? Never?
Depends how many people you went out with.
Yeah, I suppose if you're
Yeah.
doing a big table, you don't want to.
No.
Yeah.
I've been out and played like credit card roulette.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We didn't have that in our time. I wish we did. That would have been a good way to do these things.
Only when everybody agrees though, because some people can't.
Yeah. And you can think about this with buying rounds of drinks. You can think about this with giving gifts to people. You can think about this with exchanging favors. You can think about this with going to visit somebody's house. You will have relationships the rest of your life where how you use wealth in relation to other people is really key, and you can have the mean in between. You can have the extreme of giving too much, and then often winding up not having enough to give and having to seek it elsewhere. And you can have the extreme of not giving enough, being stingy, being a tightwad, being ungenerous. You can do this on a larger scale too, Aristotle points out. Think about these buildings on campus, they all have names, right? La Fontaine, Fontaine, sorry.
Yeah.
La Fontaine is an author. Who's this Fontaine person? I don't know. Do any of you know?
There's a plaque out front. He was a brother.
Okay. In this case, then it was named after somebody who didn't donate themselves. right? Usually these things are
Well,
whoever donated.
well, like the Hancock building or like the Dyson building, they're usually like the people that put the most money into that.
Yeah, now Aristotle thought that people who have wealth within a society have a responsibility to contribute to the well-functioning of the society. One way that they do that is by making donations, by spending their wealth. And you can do that to the right amount. You can also do that too little. Some wealthy people screw everyone else, you know, they're gonna leave them all to their hands. Can you go too far with it? What do you think? How might you go too far with it? I can think of two main ways. How would you say you could go too far?
Donating money? Is what
Yeah,
you're
public,
saying?
spending on public things of your own resources. Yeah.
I mean, just in terms of like everyday behavior, if you overgive to your friends and you expect that in return, you're going to get it back, and that's just going to disappoint you.
Okay, you've actually managed to combine both of the aspects. The rich person could like bankrupt themselves in giving, couldn't they? They could also give it for the wrong reason, expecting too much. Aristotle calls this vulgarity, you know, or sort of empty display. There are some people who buy, they do massive things, buying people things because they want everyone to like them, to think they're a big shot, you know, important person. Aristotle would see that as a vice, and so that would be on a larger public scale. And you can think about this with ambition, you can think about this with social relations. It looks like I'm keeping you over a little bit of time, so I'm going to break off here. Sorry about that. And have a good weekend.